Hello and welcome everyone to yet another amazing panel discussion in the Metro New York Synod's celebration of Pride on this fine Saturday. Welcome to Queer, Faithful, and Called, which is a panel discussion that's going to be focusing on the realities faced by queer or LGBTQ plus rostered ministers and candidates for ministry in the ELCA. We are particularly going to be focusing everyone to yet another fun echo. Anyway, we're going to be focusing in particular on the work of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, which we will hear more about momentarily. First of all, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Becca Seely. I am a pastor in our synod. This work is particularly important to me as an out queer pastor and also as our synod's candidacy coordinator. So someone who is really committed to making sure that we are inviting the full diverse breadth of amazing gifted candidates to feel welcome and supported in our process of lifting up amazing leaders for the church and for the world. So I think we'll start with introducing our amazing panelists. I am going to invite them to wave while I say nice things about them. Our first panelist is the Reverend Amanda Gerken-Nelson. There she is. So Amanda currently serves as the Executive Director of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, or ELM. ELM believes the public witness of LGBTQIA+ ministers transforms the church and enriches the world. Amanda was ordained in 2015 and served an ELCA congregation in Connecticut before taking her call with ELM. She's a proud member of Proclaim, ELM's professional cohort of publicly out LGBTQIA+ seminarians, deacons, and pastors. Amanda lives in Portland, Maine, and is rostered in the New England Synod. Thank you for being with us, Amanda.
Thanks for the invite.
Of course. I'd now like to introduce the Reverend Kelsey Brown. Kelsey is a queer 20-something, originally from Long Island, New York, and a daughter both of Christ's Church and the Metro New York Synod. She serves as the pastor and developer of Jehu's Table, a worshiping community in East New York. She's involved in advocacy work throughout the church and the world, particularly around the intersections of race and LGBTQIA+ identities. And last but not least, we have the Reverend Mark Erson. Born on Staten Island and baptized at Messiah Lutheran Church, Mark is a fourth or fifth career type of pastor, having worked as a youth director, a theater artist, a teacher, and then a variety of other odd jobs. Mark serves as pastor of St. John's Lutheran Church on Christopher Street in Manhattan in the shadow of the Stonewall National Memorial. Mark is married to his high school sweetheart, the amazing Scott Jordan. Welcome, Mark, welcome, Kelsey, welcome, Amanda. I am so happy that you all could be with us for this conversation. So we're just gonna dive in. I think because I introduced ELM and we talked a little bit about it in Amanda's bio there, her introduction, I would just like to invite you, Amanda, to start to tell us a little bit about the history of ELM. What's it all about? How did the movement that it's part of start? And how has it transformed from the beginning to today? Knowing a lot of our viewers out there, this may be their first encounter with the organization. I think you're muted.
I did that for myself. There's like an odd noise outside. Sorry. Yeah, no, this is great. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about ELM. So our organization has its history about 30 years ago at the crux of pandemic and institutional change. And the pandemic at the time was the AIDS crisis. And the institutional change was the formation of the newly forming ELCA. So folks may know, may not know that the ELCA was actually a merger of some earlier church bodies that formed the ELCA around the year 1988. And that's when some seminarians out at the seminary in Berkeley, California, who identified as gay. And at the time in the church, if you wanted to be serving as a gay person, you had to be closeted, you had to be celibate. There was no way to serve being publicly out and partnered. But these young men went to the March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, that first 1987, when the quilt was first presented. And on their flight back, they said, we have to come out. Like, we can't serve in the closet. We have to come out. Our community needs us, our church needs us. And so they did. And in the process of coming out, the newly formed ELCA said, there's not a place for you here. And in fact, created documents and ways to actually gatekeep and keep them out. And so what happened was there were two congregations in San Francisco that boldly said, we want to call gay people. One was a congregation in the heart of a gay neighborhood called the Castro in San Francisco that said, to serve authentically in our community, we have to have leadership that matches our community, which is gay people. And another congregation that just said, we think this is wrong and we want to call a gay person. And so we're actually celebrating the 30th anniversary of those, what we called extraordinary, meaning out of order, ordinations, which was how we got the name Extraordinary, which is awfully nice because otherwise we might have been like irregular Lutheran ministries, and that's just not who we want to be, you know. But anyway, so that those first ordinations, these bold steps of faith, then kind of said, okay, now what? Like, now what do we do? And that's when an organization called Lutheran Lesbian and Gay Ministries was formed, which became a fundraising body to help support those ministries led by LGBTQIA folk, initially just in San Francisco. And then once word got out about this incredible ministry, starting to fund and give seed money to a queer-led ministry, or, you know, to congregations that were saying, if we call a gay person, we're going to lose members. And we said, we've got you, like, we'll support you. The other offshoot, or the other thing that kind of was birthed in that movement was, okay, so we had this way to do some extraordinary things, but you still couldn't do the ELCA candidacy process. That was barred from your participation if you didn't agree to be celibate or in the closet. So we started our own candidacy project called the Extraordinary Candidacy Project. And it really closely lined up to what was asked of candidates in the ELCA, except that our candidates stood in principled non-compliance with ELCA policies, specifically vision and expectations, which was a policy that barred their participation. And so we stood in non-compliance to that. From 1990 to 2008, we ordained 18 people extraordinarily through this process. More people came out and were kicked off the ELCA roster for being publicly out. They joined our roster. Eventually, we had numbers of 48 people on the extraordinary roster. Eventually, the Lutheran Lesbian and Gay Ministry and Extraordinary Candidacy Project merged to form ELM. So getting us to 2009, when the ELCA changed their policy to allow publicly out and partnered LGBTQIA folk to serve, ELM also shifted our ministry. You know, instead of saying, great, this is now together, we can just like stop what we're doing, what we recognized is that changing policy does not change hearts. So we, instead of having our own roster, we created a publicly out cohort of seminarians, deacons, and pastors called Proclaim. Again, a space for consolation, celebration, fellowship, empowerment. That now has 400 members. Instead of having our own candidacy process, we decided to walk alongside and offer advocacy within the ELCA's candidacy process, accompanying candidates, accompanying committees, providing resources. And instead of offering ministry grants, like that financial bit to congregations to call people, we now offer resources, we offer staffing time to encourage congregations to open up calls to LGBTQIA folk. So we're now, 10 years, just a bit past that 2009 decision, and ELM is starting to ask questions like, what's the crux now? Like, what's the crux? What's the pandemic? What's the institutional change? And the pandemic is continued homophobia and transphobia, queerphobia, and it's also racism and white supremacy and ableism and patriarchy. And we're recognizing more deeply, late to the game, but recognizing the intersectionality of identities. And I would say the institutional change is welcome. the institutional change is now there's this like welcome that's being extended to LGBTQI folk, and we're trying to figure out what that means and how we do it. So I'll leave it there because I know we're going to get into some great conversations about candidacy, but that's kind of the journey that ELM has been on and where we're continuing to go.
Wow, that's a very rich history, and you shared it so concisely. So thank you so much, Amanda. I mean, I know when I was going through candidacy, I was very much supported by Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries in so many ways, by the Proclaim community that you mentioned, or at least that we mentioned in your bio. But we're not here to hear my story. Instead, I would love to hear the candidacy stories of our other panelists. Mark, why don't we start with you? What was your experience like being queer, going through candidacy in Metro New York Synod in, well, you can tell us the exact dates, but in like the mid-2000s, right?
Sure. Just a quick note going back to the 80s, because I'm just a little bit older than or about the same age as the Berkeley Four, and my experience was very different because although I felt a call to ordained ministry since childhood, and all through my teens and stuff, as I came to be aware of being gay, I heard the church's prohibitions and said, okay, they don't want me. And so I kind of stuffed that sense of call to the side. And around 2000, the wrestling match intensified and the Holy Spirit was not taking no for an answer, as she had for so long. And so finally, and with the hope that the church was moving towards institutional change, I started candidacy in 2005. And I had been somewhat out in this synod, and also I knew it was safe in this synod because we had a number of pastors who were out, even though the ELCA policies hadn't changed. In our synod, it was a safer place than many. And so I kind of sensed that people knew that I was gay, but it never came up in candidacy. And one of those documents that Amanda mentioned, the Vision and Expectations, kept being put in front of me, and I just kept signing it and then confessing my sins to the bishop, and the bishop absolved me, and the process continued, which I think it was sort of the case for candidates and pastors in the Metro New York Synod, but still hoping that the ELCA would change. But there was also the closet still existed in the Metro New York Synod, and I went to do my internship at a congregation here in the Synod, and I was told by the bishop's staff at the time, don't tell them you're gay. You can do your internship there, but be in the closet. And kind of desperate to continue with the process and not knowing there were any other alternatives, I followed the advice and went. Well, when I came out to that congregation, they ended up being mad at the synod staff for thinking so little of them and not realizing that they would be okay with having an out gay pastor. So, and then I came here to St. John's, and of course, in this setting, it's been a no-brainer. I was ordained in April of 2009, right before the policy changes in August of 2009. So I'm kind of I've shared a little bit of both worlds about being in the closet and yet also in some settings being able to be out. But I tell you, it's a whole lot less stressful to be out. And when I was finally introduced to the work of ELM and Proclaim, it was a godsend. I was just so thankful to have a community of peers that understood some of the unique struggles that we go through. And so is that good?
I mean, that's better than good. That's fantastic. Follow-up question, and you have hit on it a little bit, but what joys and challenges have you found in being an out pastor, whether earlier on or today?
One of the greatest joys, and I'm very blessed to be in this location, to be right on Christopher Street, to be just down the street from the National Monument and stuff. And it's we get a lot of people obviously walking by, and we have signage to let people know that everyone's welcome. And silly me, I thought all we had to do is put the signs up and everybody would be rushing in. but the location gives me the opportunity to hear some, it's not a joy, but I hear some painful stories. The joy is I get to engage those stories and offer them my understanding, our understanding of who God is and how God acts and how God loves. And sometime I'll write a book. There's some of the stories, I cry. I get moved even as I think about some of the individuals that I've had the opportunity. So I'm really glad that as a church, the ELCA we're not there, but we're more there at proclaiming the radical welcome that we are called to proclaim by Jesus. And so to be able to engage folks from different backgrounds who can't believe that a church, a lot of people don't know what Lutherans are, so that a church is as welcoming as we are, not just we St. John's, but we as the ELCA. And that I, as an out gay man and married, can be serving. And so it's a real joy to see people encountering God in new ways because of St. John's witness. So, and challenges, it's tough. I don't want to, I was thinking of the line from Dreamgirls, we all got pain, Effie. All pastors are facing challenges these days. And so, yeah, there's some unique ones to those of us who are LGBTQIA, but nothing that I can really highlight. So much of it, again, I highlight the work of Proclaim as providing, because if anything, it would be maybe the lack of colleagues who really kind of understand some of the intricacies of my journey. And of course, in Proclaim, I find those colleagues.
Thanks, Mark. And I know this has been said before, but just because Proclaim keeps coming up, I just want to reiterate for our viewers out there that Proclaim is the professional community of out LGBTQIA+ rostered ministers and candidates in the ELCA.
I'm wearing one of my Proclaim t-shirts and it says "Kindle the Flame," which to me, we have a theme every year for our annual gathering. And I love this one because for me, every year, that's what Proclaim does. That's what my fellow colleagues, my LGBTQIA colleagues do. For me, is we all just keep kindling the flame. And it's what we should all be doing for each other throughout the church, is keep kindling the flame that God has lit in each one of us and then spread that light to others. So kindle the flame.
Awesome. Let's turn now to Kelsey. Kelsey, same question, but we're going to fast forward in time. What was your experience like being queer in candidacy in Metro New York Synod over the past couple of years? Because you're a relatively new pastor. Tell us about that.
I am a very fresh new pastor in the ELCA, although Metro New York is my home synod. So I actually think it's pretty funny that Mark shared that he kind of came out of the other side of the candidacy process in 2009. In 2009, I was serving as the youth representative of the Metro New York Synod Council. I was a high schooler and super gay, but my dad was dying. I had a lot of things going on. Girl, I was struggling. So a call to ministry was not even a thought in my head. It had been kind of tossed around throughout my home congregation. Oh, Kelsey, you should be a pastor. But I was hell-bent on being a nurse. I thought that that's what God was calling me to do. And I packed my things up on Long Island and moved to Staten Island to go to Wagner College, a college of the ELCA. And by the time I made it to the candidacy process, I was more concerned about being a person living with mental illness and some mental health issues, depression and anxiety specifically, than I was about being a queer person going through the candidacy process. There are a lot of hoops for candidates to jump through, and there are hoops that need to be there. There needs to be some evaluation so that we have pastors in the church that are safe and that can facilitate safe relationships. I understand all of that. But my focus was, are they going to think I can't be a pastor because of X, Y, and Z? Luckily, the Candidacy Committee of the Metro New York Synod, similarly to Mark's experience, never really asked me things about being queer. There wasn't a lot of intense pressure to kind of answer questions around my gender or sexuality, which was really great. I had heard horror stories from my colleagues at seminary who were LGBTQIA about the difficulties that they faced in candidacy. And it was a joy for me to come to candidacy meetings and see folks that I had known for basically my whole life and sit and talk about why I felt the Spirit was calling me to ministry and to join together to kind of imagine where I would fit in the church as a rostered leader. That is not the case everywhere. And something that I feel that Metro New York has done really well is we treat candidates the same. There is a great joy in being a member of the LGBTQIA community. But when we talk about this idea, specifically in womanist theology, about being doubly othered, where you have these variety of intersections. So I'm a woman, a person of color, I'm young, I'm queer. And when you add all of those things together, sometimes it is really good to step into a place and to not be othered, to just be Kelsey, who has gifts for ministry, and to be able to show those gifts. I think that Metro New York has done a great job of affirming folks' call for ministry and taking seriously the work of shepherding and walking alongside candidates in a real way. Could we do it better? Yes. In the panel after this one, I'll be joined with Reverend Kevin to talk about the intersections of race. And I think that as a synod as diverse as our own, there are things in the candidacy process, as Amanda talked about, ELM's commitment to these other intersections as the work of ELM, that the candidacy committee can keep doing that work. There are people with varying abilities. There are people with needs that need to be met by the candidacy committee as just one part of these many intersections.
Thank you, Kelsey. So follow up. In your short but rich time at Jehu's table, and you know, in your internship too, all that kind of stuff, what have the joys and challenges been of being an out pastoral leader?
Speaking of internship, I also just want to let everyone know that's watching, Becca and I did internship at the same congregation. We were blessed to be in Santa Monica, California, at St. Paul's Lutheran Church, which was an internship chosen for LGBTQIA candidates. So one of the greatest joys of my time on internship and my time as a leader in the ELCA was being able to serve unapologetically, to be able to walk into a space and claim that I am there to do the work of a pastor, despite all of these things that people may think I shouldn't be bringing to the table. A great joy of being the pastor at Jehu's table is because of my predecessor colleague, the Reverend Lenny Duncan, who stepped in to do a lot of the preliminary work of welcome at Jehu's table. I was able to step in again in these full identities and be really welcomed. Tomorrow, we are celebrating RIC Sunday, which celebrates our status as a reconciling Christ congregation and affirming our wide welcome to all folks. So being able to do that for the first time with this congregation is a great joy. There have been challenges, more so along the lines of race than sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next panel. But I think that we serve a God that delights in diversity, and that diversity is the biggest joy about serving. Is we don't serve a carbon copy. We serve individual people with complex lives, and we meet them where they're at. So that has been a great joy.
That's wonderful. And yes, well, a great internship site we shared. When I said internship, I wasn't even thinking about that. Anyway, so, you know, Mark referenced this, Kelsey referenced this. Although there were many ways that I think both of you felt affirmed during your candidacy process, even though obviously the challenges that you both faced were different. I think you both referenced the fact that nationally across the country, out candidates, LGBTQIA+ candidates, do face a lot of challenges in candidacy, and are rostered leaders. Many of them face challenges in ministry in sort of direct relationship to their identity as an out pastor. So I guess I'm gonna invite Amanda first, but then anyone can jump in, because Amanda, you relate to folks all over the country. Can you just talk a little bit about what some of those challenges look like?
Yeah, so I think it is an important thing to recognize that our church is a very diverse church, and the human sexuality statement that passed in 2009 that then gave us permission to change, you know, ELCA policies to welcome LGBTQI+ leaders is a benign policy, you know, benign and also contradictory. Within the policy itself, you know, it calls LGBTQIA people something short of an abomination, and it says, and it's okay, and they can get married, you know. And I know people who know maybe that might be a slight exaggeration, but only slight, you know, because within it, we had to include something that allowed for compromise, because it took a while to get to even be able to pass something. So it has felt like in some ways that kind of holding both of those things in the same statement in our church has been called bound conscience. And bound conscience has been a permission-giving device for continued bigotry, in my professional opinion. And what I mean by that is you still have churches, you still have candidacy committees, you still have members of the church who could say to Kelsey, who could say to Mark, who could say to you, Becca, or me, nope, like not welcome, don't have to welcome, next candidate, please. And that's maybe the most severe side, you know, of what we still experience in the church. And then there's this other part that is that, you know, I mentioned like, what's the institutional change now, which is this quote unquote welcome. And, you know, Bishop Eggensteiner and Bishop Strickland in the previous hour, you know, talked about how when they see all are welcome, they both kind of go, you know, because there's this aspect of all are welcome is actually an invitation to conformity, is what Bishop Eggensteiner said. And I think that's really right on. There's this aspect of power dynamics within the church that sometimes we don't like to interrogate, but we need to, which kind of says that when we welcomed you in, it was we welcome you in as long as you look like, act like, behave like, you know, what has been the acceptable realm of pastoral ministry. There's not like this recognition of who you is and who you are and who you will be is going to change us. And that's great. It was like, come in as long as you look like, act like, and behave like us. So there's that aspect of conformity that I think the LGBTQI+ community has had to grapple with. And there will always be people within marginalized communities who, for safety and for, you know, economic stability, will say, I can compromise some of these things so that I can do this, maybe not even realizing that they're compromising. And there are some who will say, but that's not who I am. So within candidacy, we have this tension, and that means that candidates are still expected to educate their candidacy committees on LGBTQIA+ identities. And then there's an odd power dynamic, right? So now the candidate is becoming the teacher and does it depend on how well they describe what their identity is, that gets them into candidacy? That power dynamic is really tricky. Queer welcome does not necessarily mean that a community is anti-racist or that has other interrogated, prejudices, or has interrogated their other prejudices. So as Kelsey mentioned, and I hope you'll talk a bit about this, Kelsey, but when you walk into a space and you have, a multitude of identities, and the queer community is just as guilty of this. We've not interrogated our racism. We've not interrogated the patriarchy. And so our candidates are experiencing that on internships, in seminaries, in candidacy committees. And I think the going back to that conformity idea is, our queer leaders, first of all, we're really struggling to find internship sites, congregations that are willing enough to find, to support a queer candidate. But then when they get an internship site, they're saying, "You're welcome. Can you just not talk quite so much about your partner? Can you not talk about gay stuff all the time?" And it's this idea of we don't interrogate how often our straight pastors talk about their spouses or about their lives, but all of a sudden, when it's a person whose context, identities, are different from yours, that becomes scrutinized. So our members come in with this great God-given passion for serving the church. And honestly, sometimes I see that light dim, 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 dim with each micro or macro aggression that they face, whether it be because of their racial identity, because of their gender identity, because of their sexuality. And so that part is still happening, across our nation.
Thanks, Amanda. A follow-up to that too. I know that that historically, post 2009, it has taken LGBTQIA+ rostered ministers significantly longer, oftentimes to receive a first call or to be able to have mobility for a second or a third call. Is that still the case? And or what change have you seen in that over the last 10 years or so?
It is still the case. And, we had, one of our colleagues had to wait over 10 years, for a call. What we find now is that white, cisgender, gay men get calls fairly quickly in the church. If you change any of those preceding descriptors and identities, you can add time for everyone. So not being white, not being cisgender, not being gay, and I don't mean hetero, and not being a man. You can add time for each of those things for a first call or for mobility. And, LGBTQIA folks wait a long time. The only people who might wait longer are women of color.
And if you are both of those things,
Right.
you can expect to wait significantly longer. Amanda and I had a conversation this week with one of our colleagues, Ben, and we talked about who we kind of bring into the space with us when we have interactions like this. So Becca, your question, who we're bringing into the space, I'm bringing our trans colleagues who continue to wait astronomically long for churches, for calls, for internship sites, for journey throughout the candidacy process. The future of what that looks like is congregations that are ready and willing and open and able to invite incredibly gifted, multifaceted trans pastors into their congregations to lead. Part of what I think the candidacy process does for each of us, among a plethora of other things that we learn at the seminary level, is we're taught and trained. And by the time we get to approval for ordination, we've been stamped, we're good to go. And I think it's a real disservice to watch our trans siblings who are so called, who have jumped through the same hoops as we have jumped through as cisgendered folks, that meaning not trans. It's been hard to watch those colleagues wait and struggle to find their place. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelsey. So we have about 10 minutes left. I don't know if there are any questions out there on the Facebook Live. If so, Christopher, feel free to send them. In the meantime, though, I want to sort of jump off what you were talking about, Kelsey, and just ask all of you, actually, here in the Northeast, as out pastors in relatively affirming synods and areas of the country, why has it been important to you guys to remain involved in this work? And where do you think the movement's headed? What work is left to be done here in Metro New York or in the Northeast, in the places where we sometimes congratulate ourselves for being so affirming and sort of ahead of the game? Like, so that was actually a couple questions, but I'll just throw that out there and anyone can jump in.
This is like the pastor politeness, right? Like, no, you go.
We're on it. We're on a live.
Yeah, yeah.
Don't be polite right now.
Kelsey, can I invite you to go first?
I really want to hear what Mark has to say. That's what I was waiting for. I was like, Mark.
Well, I think this is answering one of your questions, Becca. I'll give it a shot.
Sorry, I can repeat them if you need.
I really appreciate Kelsey bringing up the way we can be there for one another, and especially for those who continue to be voices that aren't as present at the table that need to be, and we need to keep opening ourselves up to stories. One of the reasons, and for their sake, because as Amanda said, I mean, even though my gay label is such a small G now, I'm still white, I'm still male, and so I have such an easier time, and so I want to work for greater inclusion, and in fact, yeah. So, but one of the Bible stories that gives me encouragement and what keeps driving me is oftentimes we think about the Exodus as a big central Old Testament story that's so informative. But for me, there's a more informative story, and that's in the exile. And if you look at what Isaiah and the other prophets are writing, and there's the talk of the remnant returning from exile with new enthusiasm, with new excitement for the story of God. And they come back to a place in ruins. And they come back to people who have lost heart, to people whose world has changed and isn't what it used to be, and they're in despair. And it's those returning exiles who therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return and come with singing unto Zion. And I think of those of us who have been in exile for so long, that we bring back a joy, we bring back an awareness of the mercy and the grace of God that the church has not always taught, but thank goodness for the Holy Spirit who has kept feeding those of us in exile to keep the faith and to keep moving forward, to cross through the wilderness and to come back to the place of ruins. Everybody loves to talk about the church is dying, the church is dying. It's like that ruined city of Jerusalem. But those of us who have been in exile, I think we bring a special story, a special understanding of what it means to hold the faith in exile. And so I keep doing this because of the new life that our proclamation and our witness can bring to the church, but also to make sure that all the exiles get to come back and all the exiles are included in the return and the rebuilding of a new, in the Old Testament, it's New Jerusalem, but for us, a new church. And so I hope that answered at least one of your questions.
It did. So you guys, we have about 5 minutes left, and we've had a couple of questions come through on the chat that all sort of share a similar theme. So if it's all right, I want to just sort of, as our wrap-up question, ask, how can individuals and congregations and synodical bodies be part of making positive change? And in response to the questions, I want to say, particularly in either synods or areas of the country where there are not as many or any out LGBTQIA plus rostered ministers to kind of look to either do that education, shepherd that change, or sort of model what that might look like. So, Mark just spoke. Clearly, we're not very good at just jumping in. So maybe I'll throw that to Kelsey, and from Kelsey, we can go to Amanda. Or Kelsey
Sorry.
can pass it.
No, that's fine. I think figuring out resources, Reconciling Works has tons of them. Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries has tons of them. Being able to, as lay folk, to talk with your congregations about where your welcome is. Everyone gets to start where they start. If your welcome isn't as wide as it can be, then do some of that work, and partnering with Reconciling Works to become RIC, to do some of the work around becoming a Reconciling in Christ congregation first, so that we don't have as many microaggressions and macroaggressions like Amanda was talking about. As that work starts to get fleshed out, you can be the first congregation in your area to call a gay pastor or a trans pastor. You can make those steps to say, here we are, this is what we believe in, so we're going to invite this specific person, this particular person, this extraordinary person, to come and partner alongside us as our pastor, as our deacon. Support those queer folks in your congregations, because I'm sure they're there. And do that work on the very basic level, and the change will come. There's been 10 years since 2009, and change still needs to come, and there will continue to be. So I would say start small. We're not expecting every congregation to be where they're not, but all of those small steps inch us closer and closer towards the goal, which is full inclusion, which is full inclusion not just for LGBTQIA plus folks, but for the variety of people that we serve. Amanda.
So I don't think this is a contradiction to Kelsey when she says start small, start where you are. I think that's great. And look up, and what I mean by looking up is like live your faith publicly. And that means, showing up to events. That means like speaking about how your Christian values impact your decision making. Like I attend Pride because I'm a Christian and I believe that this is like an important thing to do. So wear your faith publicly. I think that's something that we value. The other thing that I would say, and I have a little bit of a glimpse of this in my role with ELM, is for those who are watching, clearly you're aware that your church or your ministry is part of a synod. And I would say your synod is also then part of a larger body. And you have a responsibility to paying attention to how that larger body and institution impacts who you are. We have this symbiotic relationship. I mean, a really beautiful image of that is the work that the Metro New York Synod did last summer at the Churchwide Assembly to bring the sanctuary resolution to the ELCA Churchwide Assembly. And now we are a sanctuary denomination. Not the most popular decision by the ELCA, but so important, and I think what I mean by that is be a voice. I also heard Pastor or Bishop Strickland mention, in the previous hour, that 2009 is so often brought up in our larger church circles as a euphemism for pain, for leaving, for financial insecurity, for conflict. It's never brought up in larger circles as this bold, beautiful moment when the church took a step towards reconciling with the LGBTQI community, and how wonderful it would be to step boldly in that faith moving forward as the only Lutheran expression in the United States that says we welcome gay people, lesbian people, bisexual people, trans people, queer people. So what would it mean for Lutherans to live boldly in our faith and publicly in our faith? And I think part of that means I would ask you, pay attention, ask your bishop what's talked about at the Conference of Bishops. Make sure that you are.
No, we've got like 15. We've got like 15
Great.
seconds.
I'm going to stop. The soapbox fell over. Yeah.
Wanted you to know.
Yeah, good. Thanks for stopping me. Yeah.
No, ask your bishop. I love it. I love it.
Oh, no,
I think
ask your bishop. Ask your bishop. Yeah.
phone should be ringing off the hook. No, this
Yeah.
is brilliant. We're about to get cut off. I am so grateful to you all for sharing with us today. This has been a really beautiful conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone out there who is watching and chatting.